Hi class and welcome to chapter 15. Today we are going to be going over the cardiovascular circulatory system. So to start off with, we're going to be talking about the heart and sort of discussing its capabilities, but to kind of begin, we have to think about the cardiovascular system as a whole. So the heart is going to be pumping liters and liters of blood through the body each day. In fact, it pumps about 7,000 liters, and it contracts 2.5 billion times in an average lifetime. It is pumping 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and it does not take a break, nor does it complain. But what we have to think about is not just the heart, but actually the heart and the blood vessels in all of its entirety that makes up the cardiovascular system. And it's sometimes often known as the circulatory system as well. But what's going to happen is the heart itself is going to pump blood, and it's pumping it through vessels such as arteries, which are going to carry blood away from the heart, and it's going to carry it to smaller arteries called arterioles. Then eventually what will happen is it's going to meet up at this meshwork called capillaries, where the gas exchange occurs. And then finally, the capillaries will bound up to this very small type of vein called a venule. And we get into larger veins, and then eventually we'll make our way back to the heart. So we're going to be talking about this idea of systemic and pulmonary circulation, and basically how this blood is moving through the heart. All right, so to kind of get into this idea, the cardiovascular system refers to both the heart and the blood vessels. So the pumping action of the heart is actually transporting blood through vessels, whether they be arteries or veins. And there's two circuits to which this happens. There's a pulmonary circuit and a systemic circuit. The pulmonary circuit is going to transport very low oxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. So basically, you're moving the blood to the lungs in order to get rid of this kind of contaminated blood, if you will, with carbon dioxide and waste products. And you're going to be picking back up oxygenated blood. So in the lungs, blood picks up oxygen and it drops off that carbon dioxide. Now what's going to happen is now you have this oxygen-rich blood that's now going to be transported through the systemic circuit. And it's going to go from the heart to the body cells via these arteries. And eventually what will happen is it's going to carry it to all the different tissues. Then on the way, it's going to be picking up waste products as it's delivering these nutrients and oxygen. And all of that blood will go back to the heart, and we'll kind of start all over again. So when we think about this figure, what you're going to see is that the left side is going to contain the oxygen-rich blood. So that's going to be the sort of systemic circuit, if you will, versus the right side that you see in blue is kind of the oxygen poor side. So the blue side that you see is sort of the pulmonary circuit, and then the red will be sort of that systemic circuit that's happening. So again, blood is being picked up and taken to the heart. It actually is going to start off in this right atrium. The blood will move to the right ventricle, and it gets carried out these pulmonary arteries to the lungs. The lungs provide that gas exchange. They give us that oxygenated blood. It's going to come back out through the pulmonary veins, go back to the left atrium, left ventricle, and then we're going to see that all this oxygenated blood moves out to the body. So it's going to go up to the head, to the neck, shoulders, the feet, the toes, everywhere. And again, while it's dropping off oxygenated blood, it's picking up deoxygenated blood, and again, a bunch of these sort of waste products, if you will. And that's when we see this sort of changing taking place. And again, blood is being picked up from here, and it's being dropped back off to that left atrium, or I'm sorry, that right atrium, to start back over again. So this is our pulmonary and our systemic circuits. So pulmonary, again, you're carrying deoxygenated blood from the heart to the lungs. With systemic, you're carrying oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart and to the rest of the body. All right, so when we actually start looking at the heart itself, it's a hollow cone-shaped pump. And again, it's very muscular. And it has 4 chambers associated with it. The 2 upper chambers are the atria. The 2 bottom ones are going to be the ventricles. And keep in mind, when we talk about right and left, it is not your right and left. It is the patient's right and left. So this is the right atrium. This is the right ventricle. This is the left atrium, and this is the left ventricle. And so the atria are referred to as the receiving chambers. The ventricles are referred to as the pumping chambers. And here you can truly see the anatomical heart. The heart size itself will vary in size and shape. It does sit in the thoracic cavity. And again, on average is about 13 to 14 centimeters long and about 9 centimeters wide. Now, in terms of location, it's posterior to the sternum. So it sits behind the sternum. It's medial to the lungs. We're getting a lot of that, that medical terminology back. Anterior to the vertebral column. And it actually lies beneath the second rib at the base. So when we talk about the base and the apex, this is the apex of the heart versus, again, here we're thinking about that base. So the base lies beneath the second rib. The apex is at the fifth intercostal space. And these are actually quite useful to understand because that is where we're going to be looking for heart sounds. All right, so now you can actually see that a little bit better, kind of where it sits. So again, it is going to be posterior to the sternum, anterior to the vertebral column. It's going to be medial to the lungs. And again, as you can sort of see, it sort of sits off on that left-hand side. And again, when we think about the apex, that's sort of like that cone-like shape versus the base, you can sort of see is in that portion here. So again, we look for the ribs, we look for the intercostal space, and that helps us to identify heart sounds as well. All right, now we have to think about the coverings around the heart. So the pericardium is the large covering over the heart and the blood vessels. And there are different types of pericardium. There's the fibrous pericardium, which is the outer layer. Deep to the fibrous pericardium is called the parietal pericardium. This actually is the outer layer of the membrane. And then the visceral pericardium actually is also known as the epicardium. It's actually attached to the surface of the heart. So you have many different layers that you're going to see as part of the heart itself. And then when we think about the actual heart wall itself, this is where it gets a little bit easier. Instead of it just being sort of the layers over top, you have the epicardium, which is the outer or visceral pericardium. You have the myocardium, which is the actual heart muscle. And then you have the endocardium, which is the inner portion of the heart that is actually lining all the chambers. And it's a very thin layer versus the myocardium is very, very thick. It's actually the thickest layer of the heart wall. And again, it should make sense because myo means muscle. This is a muscular pump that's doing a lot of action. All right, and in case you need help with understanding those tables or understanding those different layers, here is a table provided. Now, when it comes to the chambers of the heart and the valves, there is the right and left atrium, and then there's the right and left ventricle. But there are valves in between each of these spaces, and it's to prevent backflow. So when we think about the heart, it is a one-way chamber, and we want it to work that way. We don't want to have any sort of backflow occurring. So the valves in the heart basically prevent any backflow from occurring. So the right atrium is sort of where this all starts. Like this is our kind of our starting ground. And the right atrium receives blood from the veins, and it's carrying deoxygenated blood. So it's returning from the systemic circuit via what is called the superior and inferior vena cava. It's this very large vein that runs in a superior and sort of inferior aspect. So the inferior vena cava grabs blood from like the legs and the lower extremities. The superior vena cava is grabbing things from more like the neck and the head region. And they're draining into this right atrium. So what will happen is blood will move from the right atrium to the right ventricle. And to prevent any backflow to going back up to the right atrium, there is a valve right here called the tricuspid valve. Now, the right valve is going to receive blood from that right atrium. And what it's going to do is it's going to pump blood to the lungs. And this is not anatomically how it happens at all, but it just is to try to make sense. Now, again, it's carrying deoxygenated blood. So it would be oxygen poor blood. And what's going to happen is a gas exchange is going to occur, and it's going to go from the lungs to the left atrium. And the left atrium itself is picking up oxygenated blood, and it's going to move it from the left atrium to the left ventricle. The left ventricle is going to receive that blood. And again, there is sort of a valve right here called the mitral valve that sort of prevents any backflow. And eventually the left ventricle will carry blood out to the body via that systemic circuit. So I hope that's making a little bit more sense when we talk about pulmonary versus systemic. All right, and then here's a better figure to actually see the different structures of the heart itself. Now, when you go to look at your lab pictures, I'm showing you a picture of a true heart itself. So you will see a true heart model, but try to compare it to these pictures here to have it make a little bit more sense of what you're seeing. So up here, you have the right atrium. Over here, you have the left atrium. Down here, we have the right ventricle. And over here, we have the left ventricle. And what you'll see is that the ventricles are separated by this piece called the interventricular septum. And that's what you're seeing right here, this interventricular septum. Now, again, there are valves, and there actually are 4 valves that we're going to be discussing that prevent backflow. So the first valve that you're going to see is called the tricuspid valve. That is between the right atria and the right ventricle to prevent backflow. You also can see here the mitral valve, or sometimes what's referred to as the bicuspid valve. And let me get it a bit more in detail here. There you go. That bicuspid valve or mitral valve, and that's going to prevent backflow between the left atria and the left ventricle. But we also have 2 other valves. We have a valve called the pulmonary valve that prevents backflow from the pulmonary arteries back to the right atrium. And then you can't really see it unless we sort of remove this piece here, but you can see this aortic valve that prevents backflow from the aorta into the left ventricle. And so how blood flow kind of works, again, if we're thinking about blood moving from the heart and out the body, imagine that the superior and inferior vena cava drain into this right atrium. Blood is going to move from the right atrium to the right ventricle via this tricuspid valve. Then blood will move from the right ventricle into this pulmonary artery via this pulmonary valve. And then what's going to happen is blood is going to move to the lungs. So lungs are going to then do the pulmonary circuit, do the gas exchange, and then blood from the lungs is going to travel into the right atrium via these pulmonary veins. Then the blood will move from the from the left ventricle, left atria to the left ventricle via this mitral valve. And now we are carrying oxygenated blood. So oxygenated blood is now going to go from the right ventricle up this aortic valve into what is called the aorta, and that's going to go out to the rest of the body via that systemic circulation. So there's a lot going on. There's a lot of moving mechanics, but I hope this makes a little bit more sense. Now, some structures that you're seeing here, again, this very large blood vessel here is called the aorta. And so that is a very large artery that's carrying oxygenated blood. This superior and inferior vena cava are both the same large vein that they kind of just meet up and they drain into that right atrium. And they're going to be carrying deoxygenated blood, very low oxygenated blood. Here we can see the pulmonary artery. And so it's kind of weird because arteries usually are shown in red versus veins are shown in blue. But really it has to do with the fact that it's carrying deoxygenated blood away from the heart into the lungs. And over here, we have the left pulmonary veins and we have the right pulmonary veins. They're carrying blood back to that left atrium. So I hope this is making just a little bit more sense. And a couple other things that you're going to see are these papillary muscles, which are right here, that are part of that, ventricle that actually attach heartstrings called chordae tendineae. And these are what allow to kind of create flaps for those valves. So when you hear tearing of the heartstrings or pulling on the heartstrings, you actually do have heartstrings. They're called chordae tendineae. All right, and then here what we're able to see is just a little bit more detail. So again, we can see the right atrium, we can see that tricuspid valve, the chordae tendineae, the papillary muscles, and you can sort of just see all that together. And when we're looking at this picture over here, the ultimate goal is to start seeing some of these valves. Aorta, pulmonary valve. And what they're showing you here is, again, on the top left, you can see the tricuspid valve. On the right, you can see the mitral valve. Again, we can see the aortic valve. And again, we can see that pulmonary valve all together. So it's kind of interesting how it works out. All right, now here's a better picture to be able to see. Again, just to sort of show you that skeleton of the heart, you have the tricuspid valve, which is between the right atrium and right ventricle. Mitral valve is between the left atrium and the left ventricle. You can see the aortic valve that is between the left ventricle and the aorta. And again, you can see that pulmonary valve, which is between the right ventricle and the pulmonary arteries. All right, and just to kind of bring back this idea of understanding blood flow, making sure we understand how blood flow is going to move through the heart. So again, we start off in that systemic system. We start off in that in superior and inferior vena cava, and we drain it into the right atrium. Blood moves from the right atrium to the right ventricle, and again, it's going to go through that tricuspid valve. Then blood will move from the right ventricle to the pulmonary artery, which they'll call the pulmonary trunk originally, and then it branches off to the pulmonary arteries via the pulmonary valve. From there, the pulmonary arteries are going to carry blood to the lungs, where they are going to meet up at the capillaries. And these capillaries do the gas exchange. So where we're dropping off CO2 and picking up oxygen, and blood will move back from the pulmonary veins to the right or to the left atrium. And then blood will move from the left atrium to the left ventricle via that mitral valve. And then you will see from the left ventricle out the aorta via the aortic valve. And the way to remember, if you're having a hard time remembering the valves, so again, we have that tricuspid valve, we have the pulmonary valve here, we got that mitral valve, and then we have that aortic valve. It's a dirty way to remember it, but an old Army medic friend of mine told me to remember this. Toilet paper, my, you know what. That's the way to remember it. Toilet paper, my, you know what. Not going to say it, we understand it. That is the way to remember the order of these valves. And again, their ultimate goal of these valves is to prevent backflow because we want this to be a one-way circuit. All right, now you have to keep in mind, we have blood flow moving to all of the different tissues, but we actually have to have a separate blood supply for the heart. The heart itself needs oxygen and needs to be able to go through cellular metabolism and things like that. So the heart is a little bit fussy, if you will, and it has its own coronary arteries to supply blood to the heart. And there is the right and left coronary arteries. They are two sort of branches that come off the aorta. And again, they are going to supply the myocardium, the tissues of the heart, to make sure that they stay intact and are functioning properly. So here's the blood supply to the heart. At this point in time, we're sort of just going to look at it and see how it kind of works, but I will not be asking you detail at this moment in time. But basically what will happen is they come off the aorta, and you'll see that there's the right and left coronary artery. And then they mesh into multiple different sort of arteries that are coronary arteries. And if you see coronary crown sort of around the heart, what eventually happens is all of these arteries converge into the cardiac veins. And then they drain into the coronary sinus, which is in the posterior aspect of the heart. And this one will also drain into the right atrium, just as the superior and inferior vena cava. And that's what you can see here on this posterior aspect. You can actually see this coronary sinus, and you can see how it's going to lead up into that right atrium. And so again, you have the arteries themselves that are going to be carrying blood away from the heart. Usually these are going to be carrying oxygenated blood. They're coming back via the cardiac vein to drain into that coronary sinus. And eventually it will dump into that right atrium. And so we can start all over again. But the heart itself has to have its own blood supply. So these arteries and veins that you see here are your coronary arteries. And they are what are providing the heart with nourishment and nutrients. All right, so I hope that is making sense so far. Next, we're going to be moving on to the cardiac cycle. So the cardiac cycles are the events of a heartbeat. So when you think of lip dub, lip dub, lip dub, lip dub, there is an actual rhythm and mechanics behind that. So the heart chambers function in a very coordinated manner. And what will happen as the atria contract, the ventricles relax. And as the ventricles contract, the atria relax. So we refer to these as systole and diastole. Systole means to contract. Diastole means to relax. So as the atria contract via systole, the ventricles relax via diastole. And when, again, the ventricles contract, so you see ventricular systole, the atria relax in atrial diastole. So systole, again, is the contraction. Diastole is sort of the relaxation that takes place. So it kind of helps to understand that a little bit more. And again, they work in a very coordinated manner. So as the atria relax, the ventricles contract. And as the ventricles relax, the atria contract. And they sort of work in this very, very gifted, coordinated manner. All right, now thinking about the actual cardiac cycle. During this cycle, the pressure in the chambers are going to rise and fall. When there's an increase in pressure, there's a chance for that contraction to take place. So pressure changes open and close those valves. So again, we think about that tricuspid, we think about that pulmonary valve, the mitral valve, and the aortic valve. Toilet paper, you know what. So during atrial systole, so the atria will contract, and ventricular diastole, the ventricles are relaxing, the ventricles are relaxed and the AV valves are open. The AV valves, just to make sense of this all, are your tricuspid and your mitral valve or bicuspid valve. Those are the AV valves. And the semilunar valves are going to stay closed. So this is your pulmonary valve and your aortic valve. So during atrial systole, so the atria are contracting, the AV valves are open, which makes sense because blood needs to move into the ventricles. And so we want to keep those open. But meanwhile, we keep the pulmonary and aortic valves closed because we don't want blood to shoot out too quickly out of the ventricles. So about 70% of the blood is just going to passively flow from the atria to the ventricles. But the other 30% is going to be pushed. And that's what causes the ventricular pressure to increase, meaning that the ventricles have a pressure inside that's going to go up. Now, when the ventricles turn is to contract and the atria are going to relax, the AV valves now close to prevent backflow. And the chordae tendineae actually prevent them from bulging too far out. So it kind of just helps to make sure that they're locked in tight, but it prevents them from bulging too far backward into the atria. So the atria are going to relax, and now blood is going to flow into the atria via the superior and inferior vena cava, as well as from the pulmonary veins. Now the ventricular pressure is going to increase, and it's going to open up those semilunar valves, that pulmonary and aortic semilunar valve. And blood is going to now flow into the pulmonary trunk to go out to the pulmonary arteries, as well as blood is going to move in through the aorta. So this is your systole and your diastole. And this is what creates that lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub sound. So the first lub that you actually hear is the first heart sound. And that's what occurs during ventricular systole. So that is going to be the ventricular contraction. And when we hear these sounds, it's actually the closing of valves that's taking place. So the lub is associated with the AV valves closing. The dub, the second heartbeat you hear, is associated with the closing of the pulmonary and aortic semilunar valve. So what you hear is lub-dub, 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 lub-dub. However, sometimes patients have murmurs. For instance, my husband has a murmur, and it's an abnormal heart sound because it doesn't completely close. He actually has issues within his mitral valve, but it doesn't close properly. And because of that, you'll sometimes hear a gallop. You'll hear a lub-de-dub, 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 because it doesn't have that proper closing taking place at that mitral valve. So again, the lub is associated with the AV valves, the tricuspid and the mitral valve. The dub is associated with the pulmonary and aortic valves closing. So again, that's what you're hearing is the first and second heart sound. Lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. Lub-de-dub tells you there's a murmur. And when we think about where we're going to hear these regions, we have different parts that we're going to sort of hear for. The aortic area, the pulmonary area, tricuspid, in the mitral valve area. So these are sort of the regions that we look for in order to actually hear the closing of those valves. All right, next that we're going to think about is the actual cardiac muscle. So cardiac muscle is going to be where you actually are going to think about more of this branching network taking place. And remember that when we think about cardiac muscle, we talked about the fact that they had intercalated discs. So there's branching networks, they are going to have those striations associated with them, but they have intercalated discs. And I kind of told you, we'll talk about intercalated discs a little bit more later on. Well, now that time has come. The intercalated discs are actually between the cells, and they contain gap junctions so that you can have action potentials spread through the cells. So when we think about this contraction taking place, now you have to think about those action potentials occurring. And again, they're going to be able to kind of be distributed, I apologize, through these intercalated discs. And so when we think about cardiac muscle fibers or cardiac muscle cells, they form what is called a functional succinctum. It's a mass of merging cells that operate together as one functional unit. And so we have two such masses, the atrial succinctum and the ventricular succinctum. In the atrial walls, it's the atrial, and then the ventricular walls, it's the ventricular succinctum. All right, and when we think about this now, this creates our conduction system. So we have basically the heart operating in this very rhythmic pattern. And it's a group of basically strands of cardiac muscle tissue that allow impulses throughout the myocardium, and they coordinate with the cardiac cycle, this atrial systole and diastole, and this ventricular systole and diastole. So this is sort of what operates and coordinates the events to make them take place in this somewhat of a rhythm. And so what will happen is we start off on the SA node, and the SA node is somewhat known as the pacemaker of the cell, kind of gets that rhythm firing. And it continues down into the atrial succinctum, so the atrial fibers of the heart wall. And eventually what they will do is they will come to something called the AV node. And it's sort of funny when we talk about this as well, because it actually kind of slows down here because it wants to make time for the ventricles to truly fill up with blood and have the atrial contraction sort of take place. So it somewhat slows down here. And then what it will do is it'll hit something called the AV bundle, which will then lead into these branches that go into the ventricles. And these are going to lead to bundle branches in the Purkinje fibers. And this will allow for the ventricles now to have contraction at this ventricular succinctum. And so like I said before, the SA node is the pacemaker. It kind of initiates the rhythm. The junctional fibers conduct impulses from the SA node to the AV node. And like I said, the AV node actually kind of delays the impulse, so that way the atria truly finish contracting before the ventricles are able to contract. Then they're going to send it to the AV bundle, which is also known as the bundle of His. That's kind of how I was taught about it. And what it does is it conducts the impulses between the SA node to the bundle branches. And the bundle branches kind of split off the AV node to what are called Purkinje fibers. And these Purkinje fibers are very large fibers that actually conduct impulses to the ventricle myocardium, or that ventricular succinctum, and allow for that, that kind of contraction of the ventricle to take place. So when we think about this conduction system, again, there's just this whole network that's sort of working together. And when the Purkinje fibers stimulate muscle cells, the ventricles are going to contract in somewhat of a like twisting motion that you're able to see. So here what you'll notice is, again, you have the AV node, you have this, or I'm sorry, the SA node, which is the pacemaker up on the top. We can see the AV node, and we can sort of see those bundles. And again, they're going to be able to split to the right and left, and they will make rise to those Purkinje fibers. And those Purkinje fibers are going to send out that stimulation to the ventricles to allow for them to contract. Now, what we can see diagnostically is on an EKG or an ECG. This is called an electrocardiogram, and it's a recording of electrical changes that occur during this cardiac cycle during this idea of systole and diastole of the atria and the ventricles. And it's used to basically assess the heart's ability of how well they're doing with these impulses. And so what we start to see are these waves that are the P, Q, R, S, and T wave. The P wave is where we're going to see atrial depolarization. So this is just right before the atria actually contracts, that atrial systole. The QRS wave is sort of a complex, and what happens here is you do have atrial relaxation, but you don't really see it. It's more kind of hidden in this complex. So what will happen here is we'll see that there's ventricular depolarization that will occur just prior to the actual ventricles contracting. And then finally, the last wave that we see is called ventricular repolarization, which occurs right prior to the ventricles relaxing or going into that diastole. So that's what we're able to see here, this P, Q, R, S, and T wave of what's taking place. So the first little nip that you see is the P. This is the QRS complex. And eventually we hit this little T wave over here that's going to come through like this. So this is what we know as the P, QRS, T wave. So P wave is going to be the atrial depolarization right before the atria contract. The QRS T wave is going to be for the ventricular depolarization, followed with ventricles contracting or ventricular systole. And that T wave is where we're going to see the ventricular diastole take place. And what also is cool as well, we're looking at this EKG monitor and looking at this normal sinus rhythm. We can also try to, again, understand where the heart sounds are taking place as well, where we hear that lub dub, lub dub. And as you can see, again, the lub is really coming from that QRS portion versus the dub is right after that T wave, where those semilunar valves are going to close in ventricular diastole. So again, when you compare them with the relaxation and contraction of ventricles and atria, it kind of makes a little bit more sense. And again, it really helps to bring it home when you hear the actual lub dub of how these are all operating together. But this is the EKG or ECG. And again, here what we had noticed is a normal sinus rhythm. Now, the SA node, again, is the one that normally controls the heart rate. This is your pacemaker. And so when you hear about people having a implanted pacemaker, it's actually going to be right in the same area. And there are sympathetic and parasympathetic fibers that basically modify heart rate. So during rest and digest, parasympathetic is pretty low. You don't have to be in crazy, aspects and in high stress. So your heart rate is going to decrease. Versus when you are exercising and you're in fight or flight mode, your heart rate will go up. And so again, it's going to accelerate that SA node to really get you going and speed up that heart rate. And then you also have baroreceptor reflexes too that are going to be under control of the medulla oblongata. If you remember, the medulla oblongata plays a lot of role on respiratory, vasomotor, and cardiac. And so it will help to really trigger the effects of parasympathetic and sympathetic to see kind of what's going on. Now, unfortunately, again, people do have problems here. They can have arrhythmias. And arrhythmias are altered heart rhythms. So normally what you'll hear about is like AFib, and this is going to be an uncoordinated contraction. Usually atrial fibrillation is not life-threatening, but ventricular fibrillation is very, very life-threatening, very serious, and often can be fatal. Now, some other arrhythmias that you can see are like tachy and bradycardia. Tachycardia is when you have an abnormally fast heartbeat versus bradycardia is when you have an abnormally slow heartbeat. And as you all know, I am a huge Tom Brady fan. I went to Michigan, he went to Michigan. I was his fan during the Patriots, and now I will be his fan as a Buck. But I do remember that bradycardia is because Tom Brady is really slow. And I hate to say that, but that's the way I remembered it. And I love Tom Brady, but that's the way I remembered it, is that Tom Brady's very slow. So he has an abnormally slow heartbeat. Now, sometimes you'll see a flutter as well, which is just a rapid regular contraction. Sometimes someone will have a premature beat, which is going to be in some region that's other than the SA node. It's called an ectopic region. Sometimes you'll hear about an ectopic pacemaker where there's actually damage to the SA node and it leads to the AV node kind of taking over. And this is when, again, an artificial pacemaker may be needed to basically be implanted and help to sort of get that firing back together and get that SA node sort of up and running to make sure that their conductance system is correct. All right, guys, I hope you are having a wonderful day. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you so much and have a great day.